Thank you, Andreas and panel. Very riveting discussion on an important emerging issue, and you'll have noticed actually through the day, you'll have seen some references on screen to upcoming IIF events later in the year. If I can quickly just foreshadow that as part of our annual membership meeting in October, we will have a dedicated afternoon framed as a data town hall, in which we'll have specific sessions on each of consumer data rights, ethical use of data, monetisation and data localisation. So I hope you can join us again as we continue the conversation on that occasion. More immediately though, I'm very pleased now to welcome Jason Furman to join us here at the podium. Jason is the Professor of the Practice of Economic Policy at Harvard University. As Tim alluded to earlier, Jason was previously a Senior Economic Advisor to President Obama, including serving as the 28th Chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. More recently, Jason chaired the UK government's Digital Competition Expert Panel, and we're very privileged to have him here to share some of the insights from that particular recent report with us today. One reminder again on the app and the functionality we have in that for interaction. No polling question this time, but please do send through your questions via that app. Jason's going to speak for about 15 minutes in his remarks, and then I'm going to join him here to do a few minutes of Q&A. So please send through your questions via the app, and we'll be happy to oblige to put Jason on the spot when that time comes. But more immediately, Jason, the floor is yours.
So thanks so much for that introduction. I don't want to thank Tim Adams for condemning me to another stint of government in his remarks earlier this morning. I'm quite happy where I am. I recently completed a project for the British government on how to make the digital economy more competitive. A lot of those ideas, I think, have really general applicability, not just in the UK, but in debates around the world. And this is a big debate and discussion, as everyone in this room knows, around the world. A lot of people are coming to different ideas about what the policy should be towards the major digital platforms. And I think those different ideas are rooted in different answers to a number of really fundamental questions about the nature of competition and what's going on in the sector. And just to orient my own views on this and to help catalog why other people come down in different places, would start with three questions. The first question is competition beneficial? For economists, the answer to that is usually yes. It leads to lower prices, greater quantities, more variety, increased quality, and can lead to more innovation as well. I think all of that is true in the digital sector, but there's some other things that work in the digital sector. Some of what consumers want from digital platforms is tips on how to carry out terrorist attacks or child pornography. Competition isn't going to be the solution to those problems. In fact, competition might even make some problems like that worse. So while competition has an important role to play, it's not a panacea for everything that everyone worries about and complains about with digital platforms. If you're talking about the future of democracy, the type of speech, the way people get their media, all of that, I don't think competition is going to be the answer. But for a number of things, I think it will be. So my answer is a tentative and partial yes to the first question. That leads to the second question, is competition absent? There is, in many dimensions, fierce competition among digital platforms, but in almost every area, you see roughly one or two of them that are dominant. That's true of online search, where one company is more than 90%. It's true of social media, where the time spent on it, one company is about 75%. It's true of mobile operating systems, where there's basically two. And you go down, email and the like, all of which tend to have two major players, all of which tend to be drawn from the same five companies and have had a remarkable staying power. So economists distinguish between competition in the market, that is, consumers have lots of choices today, and competition for the market, which is you may have one choice today, But that choice might be overthrown tomorrow. MySpace, for example, was the dominant social network until Facebook came along and became the dominant social network. We can pretty much rule out competition in the market in the digital sector. I think it's more of an open question as to whether there's competition for the market, whether, as Google sometimes says, competition is a click away and a better search engine could come tomorrow and take over. I think under the current policy, that competition for the market is unlikely because you see the major platforms have been dominant for 10, 15 years now. The digital economy has stabilized to a great degree. There's a certain amount of change underneath the hood, but a lot of the major elements are not changing. The major platforms buy their potential competitors before they can rise up and challenge them. And then there's a lot of features, network externalities, economies of scale and scope. I benefit from being on a social network with my friends. Advertisers want to advertise on the platform that people access and the like. So I think competition is absent. The last question, though, is can we actually have competition? And this is where I think a lot of people come up with different answers. I think some people have given up and say that all the reasons I just gave you why I am worried about competition for the market mean that we should actually just give up on there ever being a possibility for competition for the market. This is the step in the reasoning I'm frankly least certain about, but I think I'd like to take as much of a chance on the possibility of there being competition because by changing the rules. Changing the rules about, or enforcing the rules that we've long had, about what companies you can buy, about how you can leverage your market power in one area into market power in other areas, and then really important things like how you design technical standards, and I'll come to all of that. So ultimately, where I'm coming from is the bet that competition is beneficial, that it's currently absent or more absent than it should be, and that the goal of policy shouldn't be to constrain the existing companies from innovating, from delivering benefits, but should be opening the space up so that more companies can enter and successfully compete. There's a movement afoot among some to break up the big tech companies. I think, first of all, that's quite unrealistic from a legal basis. I think it would take over a decade, cause a huge amount of uncertainty in the process, and it would risk disrupting the benefits you get from the scale and the scope of those companies. What I think we should do instead is see what we can do to facilitate new companies coming in, entering, building on top of their platforms, and maybe even rivaling those platforms. So what would it take to do that? The first recommendation is what people in the jargon call an ex ante approach. Rather than waiting until after a problem has emerged, you try to address it in advance. The problem with waiting until after is antitrust. These European Commission cases against Google, the three of them, took nearly a decade. The US case against Microsoft and AT&T and IBM also all took around a decade, in some cases more than a decade. By the time those cases conclude, the competitors have gone out of business, the market has changed, and maybe you get a big headline fine, but you don't get any new set of rules that anyone can build on with any degree of predictability going forward. So what my panel recommended was the establishment of a digital markets unit. This could just be a body within one of the regulators in the UK, the Competition and Markets Authority, or the Communications Regulator, Ofcom. If this was the United States, it could be the Federal Trade Commission. It could be a brand new regulator. It could be parts of it could sit in the FCC. The most important part of it is a code of conduct. This would apply only to companies with significant market status. It would look a lot like antitrust laws. Rules in the code of conduct would be things like you couldn't prioritize your own search results over those of a rival. You couldn't exclude other businesses from your platform. You couldn't make a condition of being on your platform that they don't show up on a different platform. All of these are relatively familiar in the European context, abuse of dominance. There are rules against a lot of this behavior in the United States, antitrust rules as well. What the point of this would be to specify in a little bit greater detail and predictability through a participatory regulatory process, sort of what you can and can't do in this regard. That would be creating a greater degree of certainty, sort of swapping out the cost and fear of major antitrust litigation for a more continuous, adaptive approach to those types of behaviors. The code of conduct would only apply to the most significant players, the ones with bottleneck or gateway type of power. Second, and this relates to a lot of what we just heard on the panel discussion just now, is data mobility and open standards. For us, a real model we had in our heads was open banking. And the lessons of open banking to me are, one, there's a set of technical obstacles you need to overcome to have that type of openness. But two, that the dominant institutions won't always have the right incentives to overcome those technical barriers if what those technical barriers do is, to some degree, protecting them from competition. And so what you needed in the UK was an open banking implementation entity that could very actively go through the APIs, what they looked like, how many screens, also handle issues like consumer protection, what companies were whitelisted to build on top of them. And the idea of all of this, as you were discussing before, is to build a more vibrant ecosystem, enabling more companies to enter, build on top of platforms. Think something more like email, where you have open standards so that any device can communicate with any other device, rather than the types of walled gardens we have in many of our communication systems today. That open banking model leads to data mobility. That's not just downloading your data, that's being able to port your data or even actively using your data simultaneously on multiple platforms. And it leads to the types of open standards that we have underlying email and the like. Finally is data openness. This is really tricky. There's a lot of incentives you want companies to have to accumulate data. There's a lot of really tricky issues around privacy. You can't just pass a law that says data should be open, but I think you can have a body trying to look at what the use cases, what the possibilities are for more data openness through data trusts, pseudonymized data, and the like. Think, for example, geospatial data for autonomous vehicles. We made a set of recommendations that went beyond just this ex-ante digital markets unit and used some of the traditional tools of competition policy. One is merger assessment with more scrutiny of digital mergers, in particular paying attention to potential competition and innovation when doing merger reviews. You want to be thinking forward, not just looking at the market share of the companies today. For example, when Facebook acquired WhatsApp or Instagram, that was for huge prices, in part because of the effect it was going to have on competition in the future. We also have some technical changes that would allow you to look at a balance of harms approach that look at what the downside and how serious it is of a merger. A set of things to make antitrust faster. They're very UK specific. I think even with them, it wouldn't be super fast, which is why relying on the code of conduct and the ex-ante approach, I think, is more important. And finally, some other issues we can talk about online advertising and monitoring algorithmic collusion and personalized pricing. Want to conclude my remarks by saying this is really a global conversation. This is the report we released in the UK, Unlocking Digital Competition. But this is one of only many reports from around the world that have come out recently or are being released. They include some special advisors to the European Commission, Competition Policy for the Digital Era, a preliminary report from the Australian Competition Commission on digital platforms. The Federal Trade Commission has been conducting a series of hearings on this topic. I was the first witness at their first hearing. The Stigler Center at the University of Chicago came out with recommendations that are very similar to the ones that my panel did, and it's been under discussion at the G7 and the OECD, among other places. I think if we do this badly, we risk taking what is a perfectly decent slice of the economy and making it worse. But I think if we do it right, and by doing it right, focusing on competition and entry, I think we can create more choices, better quality, potentially even lower prices, and most importantly in this sector, more innovation. And I look forward to be part of that dialogue over the years to come. Thank you.
So you stay there. So thanks, Jason, and I think that's a great overview of the really key emerging competition issues across the data economy. A couple of questions that have come through, and I think where you've just finished in highlighting that it's a global issue is probably a really good prompt for one of them. In terms of international competition and international barriers, to what extent do you see perhaps the emergence of whether it's direct, overt localisation measures or other discrepancies in data policies? I'm sure in the context of the UK government you've looked a lot at GDPR and PSD2, right, for instance. To what extent do you see some of those discrepancies impeding competition?
Yeah, I think we are seeing more of different types of internet, different types of rules around data. I think that is a risk and a worry. Ideally you'd have one global solution to all of this. Absent a global solution, you'd have more harmonization. So if you look at merger assessment, that gets done separately by the United States and the UK and Australia and the like. But they all use pretty similar rules. They all talk to each other. And so I think the idea that there'd be a single global rule is unrealistic. I think the idea that you could have more convergence of rules is more realistic. And I think to take a place like the UK, which I think can have very sound regulation, is one place where you could see a model for that. I certainly think the United States could obviously be a model for that, but I'd hate to see every country in the world going in a different direction.
And that's perhaps something more common to the APEC approach, to an APEC data ecosystem of having, I guess, recognising that there are different privacy standards and privacy practices in different countries, and instead emphasising the interoperability across those different systems. You alluded there to the United States, and if we turn domestically, to the extent that you see the prospect for a unified national or federal regime around data privacy and data protection versus independent states that have individually led the way, such as what California has underway. What's your opinion on the outlook there?
Yeah, I worked on privacy policy in the Obama administration, including our proposed legislation that wasn't passed. My experience is everything in the United States takes about 10 years longer than you'd think it should, which means we're due to have national legislation in another year or two on this topic. And certainly when you see states like California moving on their own, I think that is going to raise the benefits of a national approach. So I think we're going to get there, but it's not top on the political radar screen right now, but that might actually be a good thing that allows some progress to be made behind the scenes.
I've got two more questions that have come through. Firstly, looking at the emergence of tech platforms into banking, do you think we'll see two levels of competition emerge, perhaps one between the platforms, whether those are tech platforms and or bank platforms, and then secondly, the competition of financial services firms that are providing products onto those platforms?
Yes, I certainly think, I'd certainly love to see both of those types of competition. And I'm an economist, I'm not a business person. What I think public policy should do is create a set of rules, not really envision what the outcome is. And then the outcome to some degree will be, what works best given those rules. And those rules, if they're about facilitating entry and about facilitating competition, I think will result in the right type of entry. But yeah, I look forward to tech companies becoming financial companies becoming tech companies, and a bunch of new companies that we haven't heard of emerging to do both of those.
And lastly, what are some relevant options for measuring competition in this space, especially across banking and technology? With the suggestion that perhaps options like market share, price, profitability perhaps seem inadequate?
Yeah, market share, these are poorly defined markets, poorly defined prices when you're paying with your data, with your privacy, and the like. Profits aren't completely irrelevant. The observation of the large profits is part of what motivates the belief that there's market power. But to me, the most important is, are you a gateway or are you a bottleneck? Do you have to go through the platform in order to sell your hotel rooms, book your car, buy your product, search, get your job? And if you're that confers a set of power you can use in a variety of ways. If you're just one of many ways of accomplishing something, then I think competition is less of a concern and the traditional rules will work just fine.
Well, firstly, thanks very much, Jason. Please join me in thanking Jason for those remarks.
Okay.